Hello, my name is Marie Lewis and welcome to my presentation entitled Freedom of Speech Necessitates the Freedom to Speak, Transforming the Established Thinking on Variant Language. For understanding the variant language used across the minority building trades, my collaborators and I forged a participatory exploration of our everyday texts, our aphorisms, rhetoric and contextual traditions that bumped against the institutionalized Standard British English, SBE. In solidarity, we exchanged our head-on bumping against that had over time eradicated our self-worth to that of bouncing back in renewal. Because of how we came to see value in the syncretic harmonizing of our social traditions and intertextual embodiments that cohered in renewed perceptions of an equal but different self. In support of my interests in change, I focused on reform of the self through mutual reflexivity in solidarity that led to our transformative self-actualization. Our quest for change sought a responsive and emancipatory outcome to the cause of democracy and social equity. It was the open-endedness of our everyday talk that highlighted our linguistic creativity, equitable sharing, and acceptance. Everyday talk signified our variance morphology that was captured in my collaborant's enthusing of ours, we, nothing kind of talk. The little possessive noun, ours, underscored our shared values and trust that made collective action possible, affirming how the cognitive and affective bonds had awakened our hope for opportunities, signifying how compelling our everyday talk and identity were to the vitality of democracy. For making transparent my positionality as both narrator and collaborant, I explain how I spent the latter part of my youth and almost 3 decades spanning the separate development policies and the emerging new democracy in South Africa. Asserting its new democracy, the absence of a dominant culture unfolded a somewhat blunt and random conception of order, where the enforced unity mobilized multi-centered and fierce contestations, resulting in a splintered social fragmentation of competing ethnicities, representative languages, and conflicting identities. As a British national, I sensed a revulsion of my own otherness. I came to see a socially divided structure where some lived in treed suburbs, while others, whose need for employment saw their migration from the rural homelands to city perimeters, lived in randomly erected, corrugated structures. I witnessed a discriminatory system that denied education to those classified as labor resources because of a structure that had held that being different determined one's life's trajectory, one's inequality and denial of choice. Alongside this inhumanity was the enforcement of the Standard British English, saturated in foreign codes of Eurocentric domination, and coercively thrust upon a populace in lieu of their African heritage mother tongues, betraying an insidious eradication of identity that failed in its democratic agenda. Perhaps it has been these seeds that evoke the echoes of déjà vu, of personal memories germinating my need to unravel the variant phenomenon that highlighted the ontological cleavage and in-betweenness of my students here in the UK, signposting the need for a transformative linguistic readjustment because of contextual inheritances that disturbed acquisition of the target language. My resettlement to the UK bequeathed to me a membership within minorities by which I could connect and relate to variants possessing a typology that configured my outsider ways of being, my demeanor and accent as inevitably nuanced, localized, and as a result of a stroke I had suffered, practical ways of speaking, each typology thus underscoring identity, context, and function, respectively. The linguistic features were recognizable in the negative concord, the double negation, glottal stops, the exaggerated realization of guttural or hard consonants, or the denial of word endings, vowel compressions, conflation of tenses and subject-verb disagreements, loss of enunciated articles and prepositions, amongst others spoken inconsistencies. Variant language displayed its own pronunciation, morphology, syntax, and lexicon, given its neologisms that culminated in our delineation as linguistic outsiders, where we were classified, categorized, and judged as bearing lesser value. As an outcome of diversity, variance obliged an exploration of the opportunities where we found communion with others, or the voids where disparity in de certo's boundary spatializations of the dominant disturbed our tactical inclusion, keeping us minoritized in the territories. We came to understand that while language has no agenda of its own, language cannot but mirror and sustain the attitudes and ideologies of its proponents and speakers. Those possessing the cultural and symbolic capital are receptive to SBE, while those bereft of the mainstream capital are relegated to the fringes, replete in humiliation and despair. Enforcing SBE across craft-directed vocation overlooks how minority interlocutors creatively harmonize across language. Furthermore, the variant remains the cognitively known heritage language, without which minorities would have no voice. Enforcement of the British standard reflects no less the reification of Bourdieu's symbolic violence. Bourdieu's social reality, with its hallmark of relational thinking, illustrates how relationships, aside from an entity in self, better serve the prime objects of research. The slide encapsulates the connection between the complexity of relationships across biographical shaping, the intertextuality of past and present that position variant language as a woven helix comprising the externally objectified language use, the internalized subjectivity of social cultural identity of the symbolic self, and the third strand, their co-constitution amid our agencies in the shared social and pattern structural arrangements. So you see, variant language was not pursued as an entity, but rather within the interrelationships of biography, of variant speaker habitus, and context as three informants of sociality. Habitus was implicated in the persistence for cyclical replay that represented collaborant's historical imprinting over time, and in the repeated patterns by all that resides within and between the polarity of antithetical and dialectical dualities of social life, such as the objective, subjective, the material and the immaterial, the external and the internal, the routinized patterns versus the random improvisations, the structural constraints and freedoms. Now, I saw these dichotomies as comprising a graded and sequential entirety between their polarized values in a relational and connected reality, as depicted in the constraints within fishing nets, or within the expansive freedom of the ocean's reaches, and not to be misconstrued as being the one or the other discrete extreme of an antithetical binary. So starting from the extreme left of this slide, when we get to see the entirety that lies between these polarized nodes, we aspire joined up seamlessness. This is how I came to express the unifying principle of cathexis reiterated in the cycle as the notion of equivalence in our mattering and in constitution, the context in totality. CAE, collaborative autoethnography, in its transformative potential, our value of being with and for one another. Across our oral testimonies, just like the Khoisan griots and the relationships resident within solidarity's evocations of empathy, healing, and recovery. Syncretism inferred acts of fusion, of enriched inclusion by harmonizing across the available resources. Translanguaging drew from features of minorities' linguistic repertoires to maximize practices as holistic bilingual performances. Here, I alight briefly on the analogical transposition or transfer that, unlike Descartes' ruse that usefully covers and disconnects one from the indoctrinations of the dominant culture, analogical transfer reveals and connects one thing with another. And while this connection might be seen to destabilize the standardizing regimes, it configures a negotiated exchange. Analogical transfer, in effect, is the formation of an analogy. For instance, we might consider Bourdieu's ethnography in the resettlement camps of the Kabyle in Algeria as in many ways duplicating my collaborants' subjugation and denial of access, perpetuated by the conditions of their context, the indoctrinations, the standardization principles for homogeneity and uniformity, although, in truth, the inhumanity and cruelty imposed by the French oppressors for quelling the Kabyle suspected uprising paralleled more succinctly the insidious separatist regimes of my memories. But as is the case in substitution, the inevitable loss of distinctiveness between two things being compared tends to fuse them in an asymptotic fashion, which is positive when seeking to eradicate the boundaries that determine who gets to be in and who must be, of necessity, kept out. Nevertheless, analogies form a fundamental practice for us as educators, where we use abstraction to augment our students' meaning-making in offering a backstory, a line from whence we can make explicit by building an understanding, or else all ideas would need to be considered ex nihilo and sui generis. Inspired by Carolyn Ellis, Arthur Bochner, He-Wan Chang, and Toyosaki and Penseneau-Conway, amongst many, collaborative autoethnography offered us self-transparency as fellow passengers seeking truth and value across our past and present identities of otherness. Through ethic lenses for understanding the emic, the personal, and the social, we recognize socialization mechanisms that repressed our literacy practices, that lingered our exclusion. CAE usefully transformed our inequality and disaffection through our individual stories, liberating how we as collaborants came to conceive of ourselves, our feelings and insights, especially given our stories emanated from the stigmatized periphery of semi-skilled construction laborers, returned British natives classified as foreign, such as myself, and student peers whose economic status conferred their anomic inclusion as other, or merely those left behind. Importantly, within wider debates, we were rendered visible and audible as individuals that matter. By refashioning our self-perceptions, CAE shaped our bounce back. The inward gaze advanced by CAE made accessible the tacit and unseen, but nevertheless the felt and faced circumstances. It was CAE that advanced my inclusion of sentient data whispers, the echoes and shadows of our memories in an intermitted and interconnected holism. Because what made sentient data have substance and meaning was their shadowed and echoed tether in their indirect attachment to us, albeit in transient limitation, brackets around that L. Framed within social constructionism, language was seen to take on the patination of the context that informed the nuanced local native lexes that were filtered out in their recontextualizations. The context in totality brought into view the four distinct densities. So anti-clockwise from the top right, the sentient immateriality, the social, the mediation of the built environment and the artifactual materiality, and echoes and shadows across the there and here, the past, present, and future in the fourth quadrant. Bisecting the context horizontally shows how materiality is reflected in the social, in its literal provision of the lived world wherein the social discourses were perpetuated and reproduced. The vertical bisection delineated between the sentient and the spatial temporal groupings as the abstractions and transpositions of the former half. Thus the variant phenomenon was offered a backstory and setting. I cannot sufficiently emphasize the importance that our inclusion of context and totality delivered to the findings, because only by considering context in terms of the emergent crises in a devolved UK, the pandemic, Brexit, BLN, and so on, could we explicate our social interdependence, the agencies driving the preservation of national identity, the inefficiencies of decentralization, our need for communitas, for acknowledging our cultural vulnerabilities. Thus we came to see a language with no borders, la langue sans frontières, linking us to our fragility, attentiveness to our need for intimacy and unconditional acceptance. We came to see human intervention as the determinant of and by context, and came to recognize that we cannot duly extricate the data whispers from their interconnectedness with whom we essentially are. The complex polyvocality of everyday talk in which we interacted and responded to one another advanced the recognition of our mattering, embodied resources and value we each contributed. As a narrative for reflexive inquiry, data gathering from the left occurred in the narrative interviews, which were really the reflexive dyadic interviews for explicating habitus and the features of the sociocultural reality. The narrative style negated any confrontational self-expositions often arising in interviews because they enabled a rolling story where collaborants were both the narrators and central protagonists sharing their thoughts, their memories and feeling. The bond-making and relationships of trust were inevitable outcomes of the storying, where we explored substantive social issues and injustices. The second oval from the left represents the curated, fictionalized narratives of poetry, journaling, prose, and metaphor that offered opportunities to reveal emotions and insights, often submerged within the stylistic linguistic features of their presentations. It was these narratives that were analyzed in the bilateral acts of intertextuality that drew on their relation to our lives and experiences, and the interpretations, the analysis at the level of the subtext to grasp their semiogenic meanings. Thirdly, and inspired by Kate Powell and Jennifer Rousel, the materialized built environment is the mediating repository of artifacts, immaterializations, and semiotics, encapsulated the subjective synchrony of practices driving variant productions. As an example of how we theorized artifactual presences and their significances, I refer to my collaborant Ashlyn, who shared her late mother's babushka dolls that had been passed down over the generations as a symbol of the cyclic matriarchal bonds. Whilst Ashlyn identifies the dolls as standing together, the remnants of my socialization amidst segregation saw their standalone positionality as keeping them apart. This realization, together with Ashlyn's frequent use of the phrase belly up and the related comic visualizations, and in terms of the cathexis with her late mother, expressed in her "I is from her belly, I am connected to her," advanced my consideration to unscrew the bellies of the dolls that made clear their concentric connections of their nested design. By comprehending our sociality in the relationships residing between and among the individuals, and not as the collective clustering of individuals within a society, exacerbating our human predilection to organize and categorize across the discrepancies and distinctivenesses between individuals, I came to see our sociality as a medium, as a consciousness, as Wenger's thinged interrelationships of identity and language, of values and norms that moved us from a structural individuation as individual beings within society into our sociality in terms of our relationships of belonging and our becoming. As an abridged view of the study, I begin with the consciousness of humanity as an innate biological acuity that in essence depicts what I regard to be our human preoccupation with intention, our knowing and purpose, enactment, our portrayal for finding meaning, and ekphrasis, the externalized expression translating into our becoming. The interaction between intention and enactment symbolically ratifies the ekphrastic variant as a transposition of our subjective intentions into the objectified and associatively learnt and used variant language. The emerging themes of simplicity, symmetry, reciprocity, coping endurance, and analogical exchange, which was our creative linguistic harmonizing across the disparity, articulated self-remediation and healing. By exposing our own complicity in remaining minoritized, we were able to exchange our socializations for self-actualization. Here, I illustrate the 6 stages that reveal the recursive patterns along the wave outline, the metaphor I used in explicating the advance retreat dialectics of CAE. The stages depicted our growing confidence and sense of renewal by which we overcame the narratives of displacement, precarity, early exit from education, and illness we each had faced, and that underpinned the potential for transformation through the process of linguistic anastomosis. In closing, I draw on Ubuntu, an African philosophy centered on humanism, which is an expression of self within a collaborative communitas. As such, we cannot overlook language's communicative function and carriage of meaning, so notwithstanding SBE being an emblem of national identity, we cannot continue to neglect the minoritizing impacts the failure to acquire SBE awards minorities, because while SBE seeks to homogenize through its standardization processes, variant language remains an ekphrasis illustrative of the textures and shape of diversity within the ever-evolving lived world, thus emphasizing variant's legitimate place as a syncretic, analogical transfer, translanguage to flexibly assert our mattering as equal but different speakers of English. Finally, I would like to thank the conference organizers, the presenters, and delegates for this platform, for sharing this narrative of reform here today, and to honor my collaborators and supervisors, Associate Professor Isabella Rega and Professor Julian MacDougall of the Center of Excellence in Media Practices at Bournemouth University, without whom my inclusion here today would not have been possible. Thank you all very much.